Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to hear Joshua Whitehead talk about writing. Let me start by acknowledging that we meet today where we live and work on the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples, the Inuit, First Nations, and Métis. Athabasca University occupies Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Plains Cree, Woodland Cree, Beaver Cree, Saulteaux, Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, Métis, and Nakota Sioux peoples. Our guest joins us today from the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta and of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, also known as the City of Calgary. We honor the ancestry, heritage, and gifts of the Indigenous peoples, and we give thanks to them. I want you please to note that this event is being recorded and that the question and answer chat window shown by the two overlapping dialog boxes. That will open to receive your questions after Joshua finishes his talk. My name is Mark McCutcheon, and I am acting chair of Athabasca University's Writer in Residence program, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. The regular chair of the program is Dr. Angie Abdou, and the other members of the Writer in Residence program committee, some of whom are with us today, are Dr. Reineke Lengel, Dr. Eveline Gagnon, Dr. Paul Hubner, and Dr. Jolene Armstrong. The committee also includes the interim dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Manajay Manani. She was looking forward to joining us today, but she has been called away for an urgent matter. So please let me convey Dr. Manani's regrets that the dean can't be here with us. We do have with us, however, our faculty's associate dean, Dr. Hugh Notman, and I'd like to thank the dean's office for the continuing support it's given the Writer in Residence program. And let me also thank the university's communications team as well. The Writer in Residence program at Athabasca University hosts acclaimed Canadian writers in a virtual residency, wherein the writer works on their own writing projects and also serves as an accessible literary expert to whom students, staff, faculty, and the university community can submit draft writing for critique. For 10 years now, our Writer in Residence program has been supporting emerging and established authors and bringing the AU community into conversation with them and their work. This program furthers our university's mission to open up access to higher education by making literary expertise available to aspiring writers among the AU community and the public. We are proud to have brought a wide array of Indigenous, diasporic, and settler Canadian authors to the Athabasca University community over the past decade, and we are delighted that Joshua Whitehead is with us for our 10th anniversary. We do have 2 copies of his novel Johnny Appleseed that are graciously signed by the author, copies that we will give away today. I will randomly draw names from the participants list, and I will announce the winners at the end of today's proceedings. Let me introduce now our guest today, our Writer in Residence, Joshua Whitehead. He is an OG Cree Two-Spirit member of Peguis First Nation in Treaty 1 in Manitoba. And he is the author of acclaimed and award-winning books. Joshua Whitehead's debut poetry book, Full Metal Indigiqueer, from Talon Books in 2017, was shortlisted for the inaugural Indigenous Voices Award. This is an astonishing book that defies easy description. If you'll indulge me, here's my take. It reads like malware that infected the Indian Act, became self-aware and came out, and then started feeding a fair bit of LSD, early ministry, and Tiffany, as well as the Norton Anthology of English Literature, into a particle accelerator built from an abandoned pipeline, resulting in a kaleidoscopic Indigenous futurist manifesto. Or in Joshua's own words, it's a, quote, cyber biopunk foray into decolonial poetics centered around the canon. Joshua's debut novel, Johnny Appleseed, appeared in 2018. It won the Lambda Literary Award for Gay Fiction in 2019 and is a contender in this year's CBC Canada Reads program. Actor and filmmaker Devery Jacobs will champion Whitehead's book in the event's debates next month. And Joshua's latest work was published last fall by Arsenal Pulp Press. Love After the End is an edited anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer speculative fiction. As for what Joshua is currently working on, I will leave that to him to tell you about. His talk today is titled On Bodies of Writing, and I invite you please to join me in welcoming him now. Over to you, Joshua.
Thank you, Mark. So my next book synopsis blurb, I'm gonna call you up because that was a perfect little I think encapsulation of Full Metal. So thank you to AU for having me and for allowing me to be the writer in residence for your 10th year. I'm so excited. I've been having a lot of fun. And it's just been great getting to know the community and the writers and having amazing conversations around writing and genre and form and from various things from children's books all the way through to short stories and novels in progress. It's an absolute blast. I'm still here for some time, so do send your work to me if you want to get in contact, have a little kind of workshop moment. I'd love to meet you all. So Tansei Totemek, hi, my friends. I'm Joshua. I always say, just call me Josh, like save the syllable. People only call me Joshua if I'm in trouble. So I'm, again, very happy to be here. And I'm going to be sharing a little bit of keynote about writing, about things I've learned as a writer, and specifically as a BIPOC and or queer writer. Kind of behind the scenes things I don't think I was taught in creative writing classes. So I'm going to be sharing a bit of that with you. And then a little bit of writing from the forthcoming book, as Mark mentioned, which is titled Making Love with the Land. And it's a book of creative nonfiction that really details indigeneity, primarily queerness, mental health and queerness, and is set primarily within the confines of Alberta and Manitoba. So there might be some Easter eggs you recognize, everywhere from Calgary to Writing on Stone, a bit of Edmonton. And then for folks from Treaty 1, Manitoba, you also might recognize some things. And that is slated to release fall 2022. Hopefully we'll all be vaccinated and we can all kind of get back to gathering and get together again and chatting. So I'm very excited to share this with you folks. Again, questions, do throw them in the chat box and we can answer as many as we can. We'll just have a fabulous old time here on a Friday. And here in Calgary, it's like intensely blizzarding, so it feels like a good time to be in and sharing stories. So this is titled On Bodies of Writing. I have long argued from and for the body. I have noted that this physical body we inhabit, this zipper of skin, will always be inherently tied to the body of text that we produce. I think this particularly true for BIPOC, disabled, queer, and or women writers, and any intersection therein of. That we don't have the ability to simply write of aesthetics. I can never write a poem about the shapeliness of a teacup for the sake of the teacup. For me, such cuppings are always bound within political poetics because of two truths. One, that settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy have failed, and two, because my existence has and will always be a radical act of political livelihood. Such that when I write from the body, how story is attached to me integrally, umbilically almost, and how we feed and nourish one another like regurgitant birds, body that is Josh's body, and body of text that I produce. To think that one is a master, albeit while running a master class or desiring to master craft, is wholly violent. Stories are oratory, even when they're written on the page, for they require animations in order to be serviced. They require the reader. And such an animation, in Nehiao or Cree fashions, makes story a very animate being, living vocabulary, kin we are accountable to. I refuse to be trauma bonded with my stories that I hold like lovers. Dare I place a possessive my in acknowledging my stories? Too often such possessions rouse in me a wick that feels too much like a wildfire. How then, I ask, is storying akin to lovemaking? Let's say you, and this is the universal you, let's say you find me beautiful, but you are only able to comment on the aesthetic, not the animations of my skin story. What an emptied adjective, beautiful. To say it with merit, you'd need to know how the body book enfolds, spines engorged and enveloped. You would need my body to challenge you, fatally so, to the point it asks you to rethink that recycled verb love and in lieu ask you about loss, all the while pondering in the lens of a sweaty camera or a misting iris, where is the fascinating pornography of the world and who is the flawed auteur? Instead, let me make a universe of a freckle, focus less on the grand and more on the mundane, wherein entire bodies of rich stories are written in the minute. I respect that of a writer inasmuch as I respect it in a lover, the ways in which languages mix with odor, and I am forever huffing oratory. I find storying often a series of attractions, like when I undress you, bear witness to your majesty. Here I don't feign a bow to monarchy, this you being from the European Union, but rather I ask, how does any single body exist so multifariously? You'll reply, coyishly, as if this compliment strikes a tender tendon, and brush it off. I'll shy away so as not to embarrass. I'll turn off the lights and make love to this you and know in the tasting of a vowel on a nipple, the perfume of syntax wafting from oils in one's nose, that a body, in all of its glories, wrecked and steadfast, is alit here in the dark with language, with euphemism, with allegory. I trace your body as I would a map, spelling homebound in a clavicle, and I wayfind boisterously because I am not ready for rest. This, I'll think, is an entry point into poetics. Whichever came first, though, the poetic or the erotic. I'm looking for me, but I've hidden bits of myself in each of you. I unfold like a crane, intricately, delicately into origami, originality. I feel most of my work is about memorialization. I find myself stuck in the maw of memory far too often. Creative writing classes will never teach you about what storying costs the body. I'd go so as far as to say that the act of looking can be such a disservice or a service of undoing, inasmuch as I'd call nostalgia such a brilliantly fatal flaw if not utilized earnestly. If the body of text is intrinsically tied to our physical bodies, the mining of such embodiments can often be a harmful unearthing. BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and writers of color already house labyrinths of trauma, inherited, enforced, and lived, that to travail these depths in order to narrate the stories we need will always be a risky undertaking. Take, for example, my poem Mikugwanyi, a poem that won me a Governor General's History Award in 2016 and was published in Full Metal Indigiqueer. The poem is about my kukum, or my grandmother, who was murdered in the King's Hotel in Saskatoon in the 60s and forced my father into the regiment of the 60s Scoop, into abusive foster care, into day schools, and later homelessness before he found my mother and began what we might call a stable life. In 2018, I was asked to come to a literary festival in Saskatoon, whereupon I was placed in a billet for the duration of my stay in the city. I have a tumultuous relationship with that city. I rarely dare to set foot in it, lest it be to visit the unmarked grave of my grandmother. In this billet, I was placed with a man who was not part of the festival, but someone who offered his home. My room had no lock, my bed was a fold-out cushioned couch on the floor, and there was a turtle in the room who despised my presence. This turtle banged his body against the glass for the entirety of my time in our temporarily shared home. I felt entirely unsafe, often calling my then partner to reassure me that I would in fact be okay. He pleaded with me to find a cheap motel to stay in, a deepened anxiety of mine given my grandmother's murder. The city felt like a death chamber to me. I was not harmed physically or verbally or mentally during my stay, but the precarity of my safety in the night in an unlocked room with a man I did not know kept me staring at the walls, the turtle's thrumming synchronized with my own racing heartbeat. In the morning, I was asked to join a local radio station who asked me about my stay in Saskatoon and my writing in general. The poem Mikugwanyi, again about my grandmother, was referenced and brought about as a topic of discussion. The radio booth we were in was air conditioned, quite frigidly actually, and yet as these men asked me rather invasive questions about my grandmother's life, by which I think they meant to dance around the subject of murder and missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people, I could not stop myself from sweating. There were two instances where we had to stop our short 30-minute interview because my glasses would slip off my face from wet temples. I asked for two bathroom breaks to dab my forehead and armpits, my back then stained with tectonic markings, and splash my face with the coldest water I could gather from the faucet. I joked that I felt I had a cold coming on, that it was giving me fever-like symptoms, so as to abate the situation and also to enforce distance between myself and them from their fear of catching said cold. I came to the conclusion that in this city, Saskatoon, so heavy with trauma and loss for me, my pores even ached to mourn. That as I left my unresolved anger and fear as foregone affects, my central nervous system chose to cry for me in lieu. When I got back home to Calgary, again my then partner asked, "So how was it?" And the only response I could muster, again to soothe any of his anxieties or worries, was, I survived. This has been an ongoing deflective joke I have made throughout my life, especially within my writing career, that I now have to ask, is noting, I survived, an ethical joke to make anymore? In Toronto, now late 2018, I was asked again to do a radio interview over the phone. By this time, I had been on the literary road for quite some time, living out of my suitcase, returning home only for a few short days in order to do any of my laundry and repack, having to leave my loved ones at home and work to the bone in order to help garner publicity and sales for my then newly published Johnny Appleseed. While in Toronto, a reporter, having researched me thoroughly prior, directly asked me, "So Josh, can you tell me how the death of your aunt has influenced your novel?" Being more of a fledgling writer, I accommodated their request and reluctantly retold the story of my aunt's death, to which the reporter nodded, jotted down notes, quickly thanked me, and then hung up the phone. What has shaken me about this experience is that it was not the first time this type of extractive questioning about personal histories and my experiences with trauma have cropped up, nor will it be the last. And while the reporter maintains the agency to leave the situation unencumbered by wounds, they have yet inflicted another, having received from me fresh insight into my book and, more importantly, into my life, again, twinning bodies, body of text, body of Josh. I found myself in downtown Toronto, racked with grief and holding myself steady through a particularly intense anxiety attack. It was a slaughtering. I felt disembodied. I reeled on the balls of my feet amongst an onslaught of noise pollution, honking cars, pedestrian babble, sirens, the heavy rumble of a train. I found myself in the downtown Eaton Center, sitting in the food court, sobbing uncontrollably, much to the dismay of those around me, the sight of grief a jarring one. How can the inquisition for and the distribution of knowledge be a type of assault if not done with protocol and with ethics? How are queer Indigenous writers, many of whom are at the forefront of what we now call can lit, made out to be wholly disposable under the guise of benevolence and of diversity? How does the purchase of a text, here $18, make for a type of allowance on the part of the consumer or the reader to have unbridled access to a writer's life, to survey the writer's bodies as if they were objects of curiosity? And how does such disposability link or braid with our understandings of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited peoples? I ask, can a story be eaten like a body? Perhaps I mean to say that storytelling under the banner of Canadian literature as a queer Indigenous writer is to make for a type of peeping, a voyeurism, a stripping, the expectation of and for the unveiling of bodies, histories, communities, traumas. It is a rare occurrence indeed for a non-BIPOC interviewer, host, or reader to ask me about craft. They instead weave politeness and curiosity into their desires to survey the history of my body with what I might call literary voyeurism. Lately, I have chosen creative nonfiction to attempt to answer some of these questions, to unpack these expectations, to lay claim to the sovereignty my body houses, and if I must strip, to do so on my own terms. Another lesson Johnny Appleseed has taught me. I find the genre of creative nonfiction an apt one, if only because, one, it allows me to control the sovereignty of this machine I call a body, to have agency in widening or lessening the whole from which the reader gawks at my glory, because I control the I, EYE, of my pronoun I, albeit in the form of morphing the body into metaphor, or as a sidebar, to interrogate the truth I am examining and understanding that it is never universal, that objectivity is always and will always be tinted by subjectivity, and I am only ever finding circumlocution. Such a form of confession then becomes a meditation on literary voyeurism. The optics of witnessing are a wager that I maintain, and as one consenting to such a form of oral play, AURAL, within such a genre, the benefits seem steeped in my favor. And two, many of these narratives I am writing about are ones that I have dealt with or am dealing with alongside professional mental health services, and also allowing my space for conversations and exorcisms from such mental health. Then perhaps I could name this genre of CNF or creative nonfiction an exorcism, one that, rather than removing a revenant from the structure of one's home or body, it asks, least of all for me, to think of pain or joy or wounds or scars as kin, again, that I house and I am accountable to. It asks me to reconceptualize trauma and mental health as ancestral knowledge in lieu of thinking it as a virus to a host. Then I too find the topics explored here less a means of releasing or exercising, EXORCISE, but as an exercise, EXERCISE, in transformative and rehabilitative capabilities. That writing traumas that are not inherently damning becomes a form of reparative writing, repatriative writing, so as to make space for one to live wholly in a body whose zipper is missing teeth. And lastly, three, with the help of professional services such as therapy, I find myself ready and prepared to narrate these traumas into oration as a form of gift giving instead. Where it may sound like I am attempting to write in a paranoid vein to match and meet the expectation of this larger project we call CanLit, it is more so a form of accountable storytelling to and for communities who are impacted and embroiled within the entanglements of mental health under the weight of cultural and actual genocide within the nation states of Turtle Island. I would call much of queer and or BIPOC writing biotextual in such a way, as noted above, that the body of text, again, is wholly intertwined with our physical bodies. That relationship maintains. I might even go as far as to call my philosophy of writing method acting. This is not something I ever learned in creative writing classes. Instead, I was taught not to invest too much in the stories I crafted, to remain partial, even though we teach under the premises of show, don't tell, and write what you know. What this tells me is that my histories, my body, my areas of expertise are cumbersome, that my body wouldn't fit within the tightening garter of Canadian literature, that the bio stories I wanted to tell challenged and made anxious those who saw themselves, consciously or not, complicit within the series of violences I so easily orated. A biotextual protagonist, Johnny, from Johnny Appleseed, is a character very much embroiled with my own histories and my own experiences, to the point that I am often mistaken as Johnny instead of Joshua. In fact, many people, while asking me questions, have interpolated me as Johnny instead of Joshua, and I've even encountered this in briefly explored romantic encounters as well. The consumption of BIPOC and queer writing interests me in this perplexity, and that a text that is clearly noted or denoted as a novel is too easily misread as a memoir or boudoir. And I'm just going to share a little bit from the writing here now, from the new book. That when I find myself in bouts of that mixture of depression inked with anxiety, I lull myself into an easy silence with music. This is what it looks like right before you fall, hums Mac Miller. I don't have no name, who am I to blame? Miller's lyrics, which come from his posthumous song Circles, situate me in my current predicament here during my own fall, which is less inclined to position itself biblically, but more so indigenously. The past 6 months have been a whirlwind of, and this is a past essay, so it's not this present day. The past 6 months have been a whirlwind of depressive bouts sprouting from loss, mourning, sexual assault, abandonment, colonial violence, imperialism, state sanctioned genocide, which for me normalizes an absurd fact of life for Indigenous peoples. It hurts to live. Trying to find out joy, I seek out others. Here I log in to dating apps like Tinder, Hinge, Grindr, Bumble. I go on dates, have casual encounters with others, and in July 2019, I am forced to perform fellatio in the front seat of a car. We are parked in the industrial area of Calgary. He coming down from the high of Calgary stampede machismo, all bravado and buckskin and PBR. We talk briefly on these apps. I find myself in an isolated pocket, one where I've drained myself of confidence and doused myself in Victor and Rolf cologne, a musky spice. Here I pepper myself as fungible and edible, two components of queer culture. Devour me, I say, unlatch the maw and swallow me. I paying to be caressed even in, or perhaps I mean to say amongst, the masochistic violence of anonymity and starved intimacy. Beneath my grandmother, who looms above us with a dusty eye, the rumble of the CPR drones by, the hum of electrical boxes and generators fills the air, the soundscape of the city pollutes my cochlea. Calgary betrays me so as to drown out my whimpering no, and the darkness of the darkness of industry emerges imperially. Here the night cloaks whiteness, and I am granted my own death wish. In this moment, I think of the tattoo on Miller's forearm that reads, "Only so much time left in this crazy world." I defeat myself and let him wrap himself up into me with a mallet called of ermine to quicken his release. There is no softness here. I tell myself, this is it. I've become a number. Statistically, I become an arithmetic here, removed from my body entirely. I float aromatically, watching myself churn into industry, mechanical almost. I let him spill into my mouth and spit out a river that quickly dries into a wash on my cookum scarf that's been torn from my head. When I remove myself from the situation and return home, I crumble onto the carpet, cry into a dirtied scarf. I become arroyo, flash flood. I craft semicolons beneath my feet made from tear and snot and cement them beneath my wet black moccasins. I thought I was going to die, I repeat to myself, and laugh maniacally to the point I terrify. This is what it looks like before I fall. I crash into matte fiber like a thunderstorm. I birth anew into a carpeted condominium, falling like Sky Woman did, except no one catches me here. I melt into the floorboards and am greeted by Water Bear. When they ask me my name, I reply, I don't know. That too has been stolen from me. Just hold me a while, won't you? I ask of no one visible, and here I am held epidermically by germs. And this is all I can muster in this mossing. To relieve the body of its disposability, I find myself distancing myself from queer life. I find no pleasure in what we call hookup culture. I shy away from gay bars. I turn my eyes away from men who attempt to meet mine. I self sabotage any attempts anyone makes to get to know me intimately. And I continually find myself asking, am I queer enough to be queer? I try to deploy my gender, sexuality, and sex as ceremonious beings, something I was taught by my epistemologies, so as to be cradled like a spirit plate, small portions for ephemeral hungers. Whiteness and masculinity are the crooks of queer culture. the essentialism of bodies into categorizations of thin, toned, or fat, the latter often met with racialized preferences against blackness and brownness. I must interpolate annihilation as an indigenous person in the throes of queer desire, whose teeth are whitened from charcoal. Here, even my mineralized skin becomes the buck from which you sharpen incisors. I just quickly hit this by accident. So in sharing that, what I'm trying to do is like teach myself as a writer, and as we survey the world, what are the ethics and the protocols of recording, and how do we translate that as writers or storytellers, and in what sense is it a correct way to do it healthily for us as people, and healthily and ethically for us as also like recorders of the everyday, through all of our senses. I guess I'm teaching myself that I need to be a person first, a writer second. Have you ever felt like one of the lopsided gifts of being a storyteller is that you can craft narrative so well you convince even yourself of its unwavering validity? Another lesson not taught in creative writing classes is the economics of trading one's mental health in for a slice of readership. These days, I find myself racked with anxiety. One, because I feel I have traded in so much of my personal life and relations in order to find myself in this particular position I am in within the field of Can Lit. It does cost a great deal to be so readily available and away in order to garner success under a capitalist system. What I have learned in the act of retrospection here in the stasis of COVID-19 is that there is a way in which my mental health can and has been abated, or at least temporarily held, in the state of being busy. And by being busy, I really mean overworked, hustling, barely holding on to the ledge of the world in which each interview, op-ed, guest lecture, workshop, and overall talking wrenches from deep within my biceps the anabolic acid needed to garner the strength to lift myself back onto that already crumbling horizon. Then, when I stand into a fractured state of being, precarity and loneliness now being such an address, I have to ask, is this what selfhood ought to feel like? Why do I only feel the trace of wholeness when I'm thrust into the busyness of such business? I'd like a deeper sense of selfhood that isn't so entombed in the purpose of servitude. Perhaps I think of Full Metal and Digiqueer as something akin to the work of what Eve Kozofsky-Sedgwick calls paranoid reading, which is to name a type of paranoia that I believe many disempowered folks, such as BIPOC, queer, disabled, trans, women, encounter when reading books written about their lives from a vantage point of one who has never embodied or experienced such livelihoods. Then I feel apt to name the stylizations of Full Metal's tone a type of paranoid writing instead of reading, inasmuch that I was writing against the canon, against literary productions that often co-opted, appropriated, and/or depicted indigenous and, more important, two-spirit lives as fungible, as disposable, and/or as wholly vanished. And then, in such a vein of thought, I would then call the tone of my novel Johnny Appleseed a type of reparative writing instead of paranoid writing, again to borrow from Sedgwick's reparative reading. Johnny Appleseed as a modality for writing ethically, respectfully, and medicinally outside of, and sometimes beyond, the reach and scope of non-Indigenous purviews. In this light, both books talk to one another, they cross over, almost as if they were in the same literary universe. I have let my stories lead me where they need to go. I think that's my role as an otachimao or a storyteller, that I listen fiercely to character and simply animate them as they wish to be. This is what led me to this current project, inasmuch that Johnny taught me a valuable lesson through his storyhood. Quote, a humility is just a humiliation that you loved so much it transformed. I have used this as a guiding principle in my life in thinking about how I relate to my mental well-being, and began asking myself, how can I be accountable to that which we consider damning? Or how can I be in a healthy and reciprocal relationship with that which we stigmatize? If we animate our pains as people wounded beyond belief, and think of them as kin rather than parasitic, Can we make love to such pains? Can we transform them? The multiplicity of bodies you house is a necessary worlding indeed. If I were to teach you anything about writing, I would first and foremost say, forget what you were taught about the greats, the masters, the canons. Never write to whiten yourself. Edge your stories so as to maintain the fluidity of your queerness or identity. Cough up a lung of glitter and maintain the femme glimmering. Your story is valued and valuable. Conceptualize your elders as theorists. Conceptualize your community as canonic. Conceptualize your stories as sorely needed because they are. Nourish your body so as to enrich the body that is textual, again, that relationship, and never sell or give it away freely for the idiom of temporary or easy success. Having said that, never consume wholly and freely either. Be strategic and selective in what you choose to record and what you choose to narrate. Be weary not to become the consuming voyeur yourself. Stories are animate kin. Those we write and those we are gifted, treat them as such. Storytell as if our lives depend on it, because they often do. Stories are survival mechanisms. We need you with us, literarily and literally, as we reshape the horizon of this nation's oral histories. And lastly, as writers, we are never owned, we are often owed. Try to remember this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that talk, Joshua. It went in a lot of different directions, and there's certainly a lot there to talk about. I couldn't resist making a few notes here and there as you spoke, and we'll now open the question and answer field to questions for people to write in. Maybe I'll just start if I can. I really like all the different ways you were sort of approaching and turning over the problem of well, writing from the body, writing autobiographically, writing truthfully that way, and sort of navigating how the public receives and understands your work. And it seems to me that it's a lot of literary work now just seems to be approached by the press and by the public as if it is inevitably in some way confessional or memoir. So this understanding of sort of all literature as necessarily some kind of memoir or confession. This is, to me, it's a strange problem, and I kind of just I don't know where it's entirely coming from. Certainly, there are contexts of surveillance and oppression that you're speaking to more specifically, but I still find it generally interesting how much literature just gets approached in this way, and I wonder whether the way some very prominent and famous authors sort of set the tone for press around literature, if that is contributing to it. I don't know. It's a very interesting problem. Thank you for raising it. Do you have anything you'd like to sort of unpack further on that topic?
Yeah. So being in Canada Reads, my social media has been kind of blowing up with folks like reading the books and tagging me in them on Instagram and Twitter, and it's very lovely. But I keep noticing a lot of folks in like whatever type of review they're doing, calling Johnny Appleseed on the front page of it. I don't have it on me at the moment. It's in my office. But it clearly denotes a novel. And it's just kind of funny to me. Also, it came out in 2018, it's 2021 now, that folks also continue to keep reading it as memoir and calling it memoir or autobiography, which I suppose I can understand to a certain extent, that the character that is Johnny is OG Cree, is Two-Spirit, is from Manitoba. His home res is Peguis First Nation, just like Joshua, just like me, right? So like, there's like a lot of mirroring. And I can see like how it would be easy to kind of distinguish or have difficulty distinguishing between maybe person and persona. But at the same time, this is also a thing I've been noticing a lot lately on the last couple of years on like tourings that I've been doing and working with events with folks, both in person and then virtually online with COVID, is that I don't necessarily see the same type of questioning, which I have been calling like extractive almost, in that if one had survived, say, some type of traumatic experience XYZ, or has historical trauma from some type of genocidal thing or act or war, how does that how and why does that legitimize the story more, I guess, is a question I'm asking. And I particularly see that being asked of BIPOC writers, primarily. So yeah, like refugees, Black writers, Indigenous writers, and I don't see that. Like, I've actually been on panels where people would be asked, say, like, there'll be like 3 other non-Indigenous writers with me, white writers, and they will just be asked about craft. Like, tell me about how dialogue works in your novel. What does dialogue do for you? What is your protocols for writing dialogue, or plot, or setting? And then they'll have this beautiful talk about craft and like their ideas around it, and then it'll come to me, and then it'll be like, Joshua, can you tell me about like how, again, like these deaths in your life in your real life have influenced your book? And I don't see that same type of I guess informational extraction being done on the part of those maybe in larger positions of power based on identity categories or class. So like that's something that I'm really curious about. And I don't always think it is a kind of conscious, mean or kind of cruel thing to do, but I think it's a curiosity that might be tinted by and informed by perhaps a failing on the lack of education in this country, or also highly influenced by the rise of social media as a form of political organization and of political dissemination of knowledge, primarily through use of things like TikTok, which has just become like, we all kind of watched what happened in the United States through large scale organizations of Gen Z on TikTok. So I think there's a lot of curiosity and questions, and sometimes those curiosities and questions are not made to be, but like are shaped into arrowheads that are, I think, shot at BIPOC writers. And I think that just shows perhaps, one, the kind of overshadowing of certain forms of knowledge dissemination and pedagogy in this country, but 2, also the lack of, I would say, access to intersectionality within the public school systems, but also primarily even within post-secondary institutions, and then also larger institutions of power too. So it's a very curious thing for me, and I don't have a direct answer. I don't know if I ever will, but I'm working on it. But for me, yeah, it comes out of this like kind of like I would say like kind of psycho-id, ego-driven way of like genuine curiosity, but then it's also like seeming to want to, in that question and then the answer that's received, it's almost like a type of absolution. So it's a very quick fix, and it just kind of speaks to me of the larger kind of pedagogical needs this nation state needs for Black and Indigenous people primarily.
Okay, thank you for that very fulsome response. And certainly there's more we could talk about there. We are starting to get in some questions from the audience now, and so I'd like to turn to some of those. Can I start with a compliment first from someone who writes, I don't have a question, but would just like to express my gratitude. As a two-spirit Cree mother, this is exactly what my spirit needed. Miigwech. Yeah, so another question comes in. How do you balance what you personally need to write with your awareness of audience? I think you were speaking to this a little bit already, but maybe there's a certain direction you'd take it in answering that. How do you balance what you personally need to write with your awareness of audience?
I mean, that's a good question. I think one, I would ask myself who my audience is in writing and in witnessing and listening, to the point that I would say my desires and needs as a writer are wholly intertwined with what I would consider my first and foremost audience, which would be like Two-Spirit and Indigenous readers and writers. that the needs and the things that I want to talk about and explore and orate are necessarily like it's in a relationship with said audience. Not to the point that I'm like being prescribed what to do, but what I'm doing, and I think, and this is also something I was trying to address in the talk, is that people who might be in positions that are marginalized or disempowered, like BIPOC or queer folks, and intersection, or even disabled folks. There's a lot going on Twitter right now with a specific Canlit author. Oh, that's just a sidebar. But I think they see like perhaps the holes in which those, maybe as for the question prior, like those curiosities and questions come from. I think writers like myself see the holes that need to be filled, the gaps that need to be kind of explored and widened maybe. And then I just can kind of see like, oh, okay, like I see this lacking there. For example, with my anthology, I was like, oh, there's not a whole lot of kind of utopian post-apocalyptic fiction. It's always dystopian. It's always individualistic rather than communal. And it came out we didn't plan for this, but it came out during the pandemic. And I just really want to focus around joy, which is also something I'm trying to do more so of. And what I tried to do with Johnny was what I saw in the forums. Like what I wanted to explore is write these kind of two-spirit stories. I think my community, my audience needed that too. And then I would be like, okay, let me survey this like literary landscape. Oh, I think what I'm noticing is a lot of great, amazing, very popular Indigenous texts like Richard Wagamese or Tom King or Thompson Highway, right? But a lot of it's like so circled and hinged and gravitating around ideas of trauma, which rightfully are there. And so kind of purviewed around the idea of like peeking in or learning or pedagogies of the residential school. Again, super important. And those are elements in Johnny Appleseed. It's hard to escape them. But I didn't want to focus around that. So I saw this kind of, maybe an over fascination, or maybe just from an Indigenous perspective, and a means of wanting to work through trauma and needing to kind of talk about said topics. And then for me, as like an intergenerational survivor of residential schools, I was never physically there, but my parents and grandparents were. And I wanted to move away from that because I'm trying to honor the work that they've done. And then I'm trying to take this dissemination of knowledge and experience and then apply it to the position and space and time that I'm in, the communities and identities that I embody. And then also like maybe do like what I was thinking about, like a humiliation into a humility, right? Pain into love if we animate them and really kind of share that space. So for me, it was like what I want to write and the audience are like holding hands at all times mostly. And I'm just continually looking for the gaps that I think need to be filled, and perhaps planting little seedlings there for like medicinal roots to take hold.
Okay, thank you. A question about you're being asked. You talked about resisting the canon, but you also show clear comfort in speaking in the idiom of the academy. Is there how do you navigate this? Is this a disjunction? How would you sort of speak to the tension there, if there's a tension there? I don't know.
I mean, there is always a tension, there's always a friction, there's always some type of little kindling starting. So resisting the canon, yes, but we are still wholly born into it as people, I think, in what we consider the global West or the global North. And again, I'm using academic language here to like disseminate these or to share these. What I could say is like in North America and Europe, right? So we're inherently born into the canon. I don't think we can ever fully escape it. Our children right now who are in school are learning canonical texts. Those who are unfortunately in a Friday afternoon class are probably within the English departments are probably learning canonical text for the most part. We can't fully resist it, I don't think. But what we can do is what I try to do is infect and invade and mutate it so that what we're doing in thinking about canonical texts or in academia, for me, is to find ways in which the knowledges or the stories that we uphold as the greats or the masters, from Charles Dickens to Shakespeare through to, in a more academic sense, Eve Sedgwick, who I quoted, or Judith Butler for queer theory, also are not wholly removed from settler colonialism. And in such ways, they're in the crafting of those master stories or these great theories that we uphold in academia. Those two are influenced by, consciously or sometimes unconsciously, or directly or indirectly, by Indigenous and Black and people of color being in those spaces too. Like, for example, Caliban from The Tempest in Shakespeare's play is wholly influenced by an Indigenous person who was taken from North America to Europe. So, like, for me, what I'm trying to do is, we can't fully escape canon or academia. And we can escape some academia, but it's always going to be there in terms of the political realms we live within if we want to engage within that. But what we can do is resist and mutate it by finding where instances or finding braids wherein like your identities might be partaken from and within, right? Where does indigeneity braid in with canon? Or where does indigeneity braid in with Judith Butler? Gender Trouble, for example, Judith Butler's text, a seminal kind of queer theory text, has archival images of indigeneity on it. So like this, we're always, like, I think for me, haunted by or I would say these greats, and whiteness is always haunted by these specters of BIPOCness and BIPOC cultural knowledge, and BIPOC astronomy, etc., BIPOC medicine. That's, for me to say, like, this language and these stories solely exist within the ivory tower or within the kind of the canon is a grave misunderstanding. Like, those are also, they belong to communally to everyone, yes, but they're also like ancestral knowledge that perhaps we have a shared bias. So what I try to do is, when I'm writing as a writer versus as an academic or a scholar, I think we need academic language. Everyone from like bell hooks all the way through to, say, someone like Munoz. We need those knowledges, but they are codified in such a way that it's very classed, and it's very perhaps inaccessible. Not to say the everyday person couldn't read theory and understand it, but I think it's a failing for me if I can't bring this kind of political organizational skills and this political knowledge and this political terminology to the dinner table with my mother and grandmother and explain it to them and have them see these in the world. But what I can do is like eat that theory and then regurgitate it into story. And for me, that's more accessible. So Full Metal, Johnny Appleseed, my forthcoming book is all very academic and theory based, the things I think are the strongest assets to things like decolonization, and perhaps maybe some of the unpacking of heteropatriarchy and capitalism. I've taken those things I thought so handy from theory or academia and then just like spit it out into story, which I think is a more accessible but also more viable political tool. Like the novel or the book of poetry or just the story in general is a stronger kind of communal political tool than, an essay published in something like Duke University Press. So yeah, I think they're needed. I think we're not fully removed from them as BIPOC people. There are legacies, I think, within them. And perhaps what I think personally, my goal is to like eat it and regurgitate it into story.
Okay, a sort of related question now. In reference to your mention of Can Lit, do you feel comfortable identifying yourself as a Canadian author or as being recognized for Canadian awards, any kind of source of tension or conflict with the other contexts and axes of your identity?
Good question. I mean, like, I am implicit within the structures of Canadian literature. Like, I am published by Canadian publishing houses, from Talon Books to Arsenal Pulp Press, and now with the forthcoming book, moving into like the big three with Knopf Canada, and which is part of Penguin Random House. So like, I am inherently part of it, and I also am inherently part of Canada as an Indigenous person. So you can escape them, and I guess what I would say is, like, I want to think of maybe something that Billy Ray Belcourt has taught me and us, is that we don't always have to exist in one single world. So I critique Canadian literature, or CanLit, as a machine, because one, it is a machine, and two, I do kind of critique my position within it and place myself without a lot, like outside of Canadian literature, because it's like the same kind of mirroring of the nation state that is Canada, versus kind of thinking about the multiplicity of nations already born and inherent within Canada, from the unceded of the West Coast through to the East Coast, from the North all the way down to the South. And I also am not a firm believer of the border between Canada and US, obviously. Like Treaty 1, where I'm from, would bleed into North Dakota. So I try to take that decolonial knowledge that I think in terms of land, like the body of land, and think about it in terms of the body of text too, in as much that I would say is like, I also like really don't sometimes understand or see or believe in the borders of genre. In what ways, like, people have read my novel Johnny Appleseed and told me it sounds too much like poetry. I've read Full Metal and this sounds too much like prose. So I've also kind of started calling myself, in maybe a more sovereign way of naming, just Notachimo, which means within Nehiyaw or the Cree language, just means storyteller, because it seems dismissive to my stories that I've shared to just like label this is poetry, because it is and it's not, or this is a novel, it is and it's not, right? Or even call myself a poet, novelist, essayist, academic. The work that I'm doing with all of those in this very different mediums is the same. So I also don't believe in the borders there either in terms of writing and writing production. So then when I position myself into this larger kind of machine of Canadian literature, or CanLit, I have to do so with a means of distinguishing two things. One, my body from kind of being put into the kind of possessive apostrophe of Canada's literature or Canada's peoples. And two, also not allowing, so my body needs to be removed from that. And that's why I say when I introduce myself, I'm from Treaty 1, Manitoba, Peguis First Nation, Oji Cree, Otachimo, right? Because to be enfolded within that, within the possessive apostrophe of Canada's, is a means of like undermining, I would say, the survival and the thriving of people who have come before me. And two, it's a sovereign act of political like resistance. And then I also have to do that same thing for the stories. I would say that the body of text that is story, to not let it become shackled by the possessive S within Canada's literature, right? Because it belongs not to any specific individual person, nation, or community. Rather, I just think of it as a gifting. So I don't sometimes try not to even place the possessive my in that, which was what I was talking a little bit about in the keynote too, because possession in any form, I would say, is like kind of a little violent. But yeah, so in terms of CanLit, I would say I am inherently part of it, but I do try to actively resist it by kind of regionalizing and placing and spacing the stories from where they come from. And I try to do that in all forms, be it my personal existence as a body within borders and provinces, my writing as between borders of genres and form, and then also between nationalism, national literatures, and thinking about whose nation that belongs to.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. You reminded me that something I heard from a professor of mine years ago that always seemed to illuminate some of the essential absurdities of the strong parallels and relationships between national borders and genre borders, and the whole idea of sort of national literature. I had a professor who asked, what is the great Canadian video game, right? Because it's
Yeah.
What does that even mean? Well, you can sort of ask the same question. What does it mean for there to be sort of what is the great Canadian novel? And I think just looking at different media that way, it can really highlight some of the assumptions in statements like that. We have many more questions to get to, though. So here's a question. You've touched on the advice you might give a young writer now, knowing what you know, but if future Joshua is talking to you now, what sort of writerly advice is future Joshua telling now Joshua?
A good question. If I could like time travel like a decade into the future, I'm sure future Josh would tell me, don't write nonfiction in your late 20s. Specifically, um, in the vein of like memoir, like you're still young, but also like I don't some of these essays are older that I've written maybe 2, 3 years ago. So like this kind of person that I'm talking about, there's several people they use or they're alluding to are people from like 2, 3 years ago who I was in like relationships with at that time. It's very different now, but the act of retrospection is a very interesting but also a helpful tool than writing in the immediate now, which I was also trying to like I guess advise against because mining pain or trauma in one's life for the sake of like singing it into story is important. And I think that's what a lot of us do, specifically BIPOC writers, which is why sometimes maybe it gets confused as memoir. But that mining, that exorcism, that singing pain into story is very difficult to do when in the immediate moment or when tunnel visioned into thinking of one specific way of translating pain into story. So I guess what I was, future me would warn me against that and warn me against perhaps what I was also trying to warn folks about being a voyeur myself in the real world. I think of Hilton Als in the book White Girls, who's talking about this instance where he's a writer, a Black writer, talking about this instance where he's having a kiss. I think it's one of his first kisses he talks about. And he says, in the moment where the actual act of kissing was happening, he wasn't fully experiencing it because in his head he was narrating it for the sake of perhaps recording it for writing or whatever he wanted to use it for. And then he ruminates later in the act of producing the written text based upon that kiss is when he said he fully thought he experienced the kiss, which was a time like, I don't know, a week or something after. So I'm also trying to warn myself and thinking about that and warning others in terms of thinking about how we move and experience and sense and record the world or conversations is to also differentiate, which may perhaps, again, as BIPOC people, I think it's a little difficult because we're always made to kind of be on guard or code switching, to be in spaces to abate whatever uncomfort of others. But for me, trying to train myself to be like I was saying first, a person first, and then a writer second. And it's a long process, and I've actively caught myself in perhaps conversations or experiences in my life, as even of recently, of me being like, "Oh, this is like that sentence they said. That's beautiful. Like I need to remember this." And then I'm like fully removed from the experience to the point that I don't. Sometimes I can forget whole conversations because I was so fixated and being taught as a writer to like hone in on that and almost like steal it, I guess, or to like make sure I archive that, which can sometimes I think hinder one's mental health, as I'm trying to warn against, but also like one's just general experiences of joy as a person. So yeah, differentiating between person and persona, writer and person, and thinking about ethical means of engaging with others that are not simply for the sake of one's archive or one's kind of oeuvre of story, I suppose.
Hi, sorry, that was me being on mute for way too long. We have a question
It
from
happens.
Sarah, who says she's enjoying listening to Johnny Appleseed, narrated by you. And she says, I find your delivery so powerful, as was your talk today. I find your writing to have great flow and to be full of impactful points. It reminds me sometimes of slam poetry. The message feels magnified through your personal delivery style. Do you have experience performing slam poetry or reading poems aloud? Or when you're writing, do you speak out what you are working on as part of your process?
Funny you should say that. So like when I was like 18, 19, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, I grew up doing a lot of slam poetry, and then also performing in poetry spaces live with jazz music. So we would improvise and do improv work together, and so like combining music, specifically jazz. I used to play saxophone too, so it was really nice to put those together. Was a kind of a way of training myself to, like, one, I guess, perform, but two, also thinking about the rhythm of sound in writing. And then I guess I haven't played saxophone in ages. Like, they're very expensive, and I feel like I forgot now. But I'm sure the muscle memory is still there. But what I do is, like, I try to sometimes even think about writing and like crafting the sentence with rhythm and cadence. And maybe this is like the poet in me coming into this. I was thinking about it as like music. It has to have spaces that spike and crescendo and then lull and have like silence. So respecting those, thinking of words almost like notes sometimes. And then also when I'm like editing or wanting to perhaps enhance a sentence, I will read it aloud in very different tenors to myself, and with different inflections, or maybe changing the grammar to like allude to those inflections. But the orality on the audibility of it really helps me hear where there's mistakes or where perhaps there needs to be a pause. I'm a big fan of M dashes for that. Kind of thinking of them as rests almost. So yeah, I'm attuned to like the sound of language, and I think I owe all of that actually to the jazz musicians of Winnipeg, slam poetry, and then also just being a tenor saxophonist myself. You're used to be one. I really helped trained my ear. I'm a terrible singer, so don't ask me to sing, but I I perhaps a good slam poet novelist.
Interesting glimpse of the early background and training, yes. Diana asks, for those people who ask you extractive questions, as you've called them, the quote, quick fix absolution, do you consider people who question in this line your audience as well? Or what do you see as their role in this dialogue in relation to the teachings and learnings we all need?
Yeah. Like, there's still the audience. I'm not here to demonize or ostracize anyone. And again, like I was noting, I don't think it's coming out of malicious intent. So like nowadays, I probably just wouldn't answer the question. I would ask, maybe I would pass resources, but I wouldn't fully go into like characterizing and personalizing for the sake of making that story or the knowledge that is being sought out accessible through the personalization. Instead, I would offer ways in which that person could do or answer this question on their own, through readings or through maybe having conversations with their communities and friends or families. But yeah, and I think I call it extractive questioning because, one, the extraction is knowledge, which is a very, I think, expensive type of resource. And instead, I would try to ask myself and folks to reconceptualize resource questioning, or sorry, extractive questioning, and wanting to kind of get this like resource that is knowledge or resource that is answer or absolution or forgiveness, and think of it more as like a gifting. So like sharing stories, specifically personal ones, is very much a gifting indeed. And then also, like, no gift is ever freely given. I don't agree. I agree with, based upon this is a theorist, Cheyenne Nagai, because the gift giver is always expecting something back. So I would say, like, in the gifting of story, again, perhaps me sharing on bodies of writing with everyone who's listening, what I'm expecting back is for also folks to like take that, and then take whatever they found access or necessary or needed or medicinal or challenging, and then also like to apply that in some sense to their lives, and not today, maybe not this minute, but like next week, next month, next year. I just hope that each story that I share or that I hear too trigger something in me down the line where I could be like, oh, Mark said this about borders and genres, and that would help me kind of question and recalibrate how I see and experience the world and how my body moves through it, I suppose I would say. So yeah, I don't think it's malicious, and I guess in any type of answer that I give, it's also a type of we're building relationship through question and answer, or through conversation, or through story. In that relationship needs to be kind of reciprocal in a sense. So there's a bit of an expectation, I think, with a question and answer period, not just from the person who's answering, but of expectation from the person who's also receiving, and vice versa for me. When I ask questions, I also want to embody and interpolate it and apply that, even if I disagree with it, or even if I don't see eye to eye, and a means to kind of challenge me to also not get stuck within kind of the kind of order of conduct that I've already made of my life. Because I think, yeah, my knowledge base and storytelling techniques are always mutating, and there's so much to garner and gather, rather and share with, rather than thinking of like taking. And I think so. It's the idea of like extraction to the means of like personally garnishing and gathering and keeping and hoarding, that I try to challenge, I guess I would say, in questions like that I might have received in the past.
All right, thank you. Another lovely little compliments come in. Similarly, not a question they write, but thank you for an excellent talk today. Very thought-provoking and worth mulling over a cup of tea over the weekend. Thanks for making me think.
Perfect. All the tea, though. It's going to be cold.
Nikki asks a question about how emotionally invested you get in your stories or characters. And if you think that investment or overinvestment or underinvestment, whatever level you set it at, does that enrich your writing? And is that something that is sort of, is that something that's discouraged in the creative writing programs, which Nikki suggests counsel people not to get too invested in stories? I suppose the received wisdom there, in addition to write what you know and show don't tell, would be the injunction to kill one's darlings, so to speak.
Yeah.
But yeah, so is how sort of invested do you get in your characters? Again, this sort of maybe speaks to the kind of public-private divide, but in a kind of different way.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this one. I think I get very invested in my characters. So, for example, Johnny Appleseed was a character I've had for me like well over a decade now. So since like my late teens, early 20s. And I've just let mulled over, and maybe I've like given him some scraps here and there, and he's just kind of become a full-figured person that was basically like, I'm ready, write me into the world. Like, here's my hand, I'll just lead you through it. Not that he was a muse, like I actually had to do a lot of research and work for the book. But in the talk that I was giving, because this is just my kind of ethical, this is just kind of my philosophy, is like body of text and Josh are like umbilically tied, that into the point that we like bloodlet or share stories. So Joshua gives Johnny stories, and Johnny changes them and feeds them back to Joshua. And also like vice versa, like there's ways in which characters have helped me deal with things because they have different ways of like coping or thinking. To the point that I was kind of calling writing as like almost like method acting, because I don't think when we say show don't tell or write what you know, and what I was trying to critique about that in the talk was there was certain allowances I think that I've seen in creative writing classes I've been in, where it's like show don't tell, but write what you know. What I know is this X, Y, Z, and I think a lot of times it becomes uncomfortable for either the workshop group as a whole or for that person teaching the class to have discussions. And again, if it's not like overly written to be upsetting, where it becomes uncomfortable, but that's what we know, and that's what we want to show. Instead of just telling you, settler colonialism sucks, like I can show you it through the active practice of my body influencing a character. So I get very invested in my characters, maybe a little too much, but I'm not upset with it. I'm very, very invested in Johnny. And maybe I'll give like a little insight, but my character Zoa from Full Metal is also not over yet. just a little bit of a sneak peek, I guess. So I'm excited to see what happens with Canada Reads. Watching someone else defend my precious little glitter princess. I'm a little nervous, but I'm excited too. But I'm just I feel like I'll have to like mentally prepare myself. It's like it'll be like watching four people completely try to obliterate your best friend for the sake of like getting their book to the next one. So it's gonna be a fun experience. I'm very invested, but I'm ready. I'm ready.
Okay. Well, we wish you and Johnny all the best in that that contest of arguments and wills and aesthetics. Claire asks, in connection with having heard Christy Belcourt Métis on Twitter talk about storytelling through means other than the written word. So Claire would like to ask if there are other methods of storytelling that you explore beyond the written word or aside from the written word. You had mentioned saxophone playing, so I don't know if there are other media in which you like to explore or dabble.
I think of cooking as storytelling, specifically through these I love cooking, through the transference of recipes, and that's altered kind of by everyone, all the women in my family. So I think that's a type of storying. I think of sewing as a type of storying. And I also think of like makeup and cosmetics is another type of storying, like the transformation of bodies, which what I was kind of talking about too in the piece, in that I think of like the body itself as like a library, and like each little like scar, chickenpox scar, or perhaps burn or whatever is on the, or even just the idea of like sagging, or skin folds or crow's feet. Those are all such beautiful stories too. So like I really try to attune myself to how like story is, we're like always surrounded by some type of story. It's like it's singing in multitudes and multiplicities, and it's really interesting for me to kind of think of the world like that. And I would say that's very much like a Nahia or a Cree way of experiencing or thinking about things that perhaps English thinks or French think of as inanimate, whereas we conceptualize things like sky or rocks or bodies of water or the land itself as already animate, as alive, as being kin. So I feel like I would echo scholar and Professor Kim Tallbear in that we're always in relations with everything around us. We're always in relationships with things like water. So we're always in this kind of polyamorous relationship with everything around us all at once, simultaneously. And in that, there's like a cacophony of stories that I think are all around us, either in the mode of production of something like sewing or cooking, but also in the mode of production of just experiencing a space too.
One of our colleagues on the Writer in Residence program asks, Paul Huebner asks, when you're mentoring other writers, do you often focus on helping them find their place within the context of what you've been discussing, bodies, trauma, the CanLit world, or do you tend to stick more to details of plot, dialogue, etc.? And how do you decide? I suppose there's a question of sort of emotional labor that comes into that in sort of working with aspiring writers.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I can generally, I'm happy to talk about plot and character and dialogue and development. And we do talk about those things. But I think those are like the surface level techniques that it's like they're accessible, easy to kind of learn anywhere, really. What I know when I was trying to see a writer in residence, or any type of mentor, what I was looking for was to add tools or like wrenches to my tool belt. And I think each writer has one of those, or like a little key. So like, well, I'm definitely happy to, like, when we do talk about those general things, plot structure or line breaks in poetry, or temporality or time in the story and how to progress towards that. And I love talking about that, but I'm also interested in perhaps giving you a key for you to try some of the techniques that I have been working on and trying to make to make accessible and usable, and seeing if that works for you. If it does, great. If not, like I have all this huge chain of jingly keys that you've had gotten from other writers too, so I'm happy to share those. But yeah, for me, it's like learning very specific. It's like putting on like maybe lenses or something. You get something very specific about seeing the world and writing the world from every different writer. So I try to also give a little bit of that key, I think, when I'm doing the writing workshops for folks.
Okay. Kevin asks a question that I think is related to something you talked about earlier in how you sort of mutate canonical texts and how you sort of navigate dominant discourses and write back to them. So Kevin asks what you'd think about the removal of colonial names from geographic points and natural bodies, rivers, mountains, etc., and whether the transliteration of indigenous words into English in that renaming process, I'm assuming Kevin is thinking of specific instances here, but I have any to mind. But anyway, about the removal of colonial names from geographic points and the transliteration then of indigenous words to rename those places, although transliterating indigenous words into English to do so. Kevin's asking, does that seem to you like a kind of a problematic reinscription of colonialism, or is there something actually potentially progressive and decolonial happening there?
I mean, I guess I would say, one, I think it's a decolonial act to like rename a space due in part to its original name from its caretakers from beginning. So like Winnipeg, like Manitoba is a Cree name, Manitoba, Winnipeg is a Cree name, Winnipeg. It's just anglicized. But yeah, I guess like also I guess this is a conversation I'm like thinking about and having too, and a quandary of like using Roman orthography in and for a indigenous oral based language like Nehiyawi or Cree, yeah, like I'm like, is Roman orthography fully decolonial, based on an oral based type of kind of way of being and knowing linguistic systems? Or like would something like syllabics be a better use of a decolonial way of naming? But at the same time, I'm also like not trying to romanticize indigenous histories, because those too mutate. So the introduction of Roman orthography into indigenous oral linguistic systems or language systems, I think is a good thing overall, in allowing us, because what that does is it also allows the creation of new terms, like for example, like obviously we never had cars pre-contact, so like kind of the mutation of the language as well through the introduction of other terms, like we never had words for queer or trans, and introducing those into our linguistic systems, and then Roman orthography or the anglicization of certain of our linguistic systems also, I think, is a reclamation. So it's like not something I could decide if this is good or bad as an individual. But I think there are arguments that can be made for both sides in terms of decolonizing names or specifically historical landmarks based upon perhaps maybe the translation from an indigenous language into an anglicized one, or vice versa the other way. But I guess overall, my response in this immediate moment would be that the transference of original namings in whatever form that may be, syllabic, oral, or Roman orthography, indigenous linguistic systems, I think is at least a step towards that decolonized act, in the recognition that these names weren't just like bestowed from this divine muse. They were in fact based upon reciprocity, maybe not as in a fully 50-50 way, but also of relationships in those spaces too.
All right, we're going to maybe continue in this line, but maybe steer it around back to questions of craft. So using colonialist language, the master's tools, so to speak, challenging that language, sometimes occupying it, deconstructing it, as well as more broadly challenging form and genre. Laura asks, challenging form and genre requires knowing what you're challenging. So do you consider pushing boundaries like those a practice that's better reserved for an experienced storyteller, or can it be an intuitive practice?
I mean, I guess I would also question like what means knowledge, or like what means experience. And yes, like it does take experience to become a published writer or to be a writer, in terms of like writing and rewriting and editing and re-editing and that kind of progressive work. But also at the same time, it's like thinking about when I was asking in the talk to like conceptualize our like elders as theorists, in thinking about, say, academic language exists within and from the ivory tower, where, and in that it becomes a classed way of saying this knowledge dissemination, this knowledge kind of accessibility is not privy to the non-academic. So I think like one, it becomes, or sorry, just to kind of finish the other thought, the everyday person is a theorist through experience, and that is how those theories are written, basically based upon kind of the experiences of the general public. But I guess I would say in terms of story, one, I think everyone is a storyteller. They just might not have the stamp of approval from a publishing house, but they can and do and can probably have written more beautiful stories than I ever will. I've told more beautiful stories, or more powerful, or more insightful stories than I have or ever will. But at the same time, like, yeah, it does take a level, I would say, of experience, and what I mean perhaps by experience isn't so much the act of like taking an MFA or taking a plethora of writing classes or having worked with a mentor. Perhaps what I mean by experience is the act of sharing, storytelling, reading. Those are also like very valuable forms of experience and knowledge that are like do make up a writer. Like a writer can be a writer with or without kind of being in these spaces of tutelage. But to write back, I don't think requires one to have fully, like, I guess, mastered or kind of taken apart these large texts, because I think we do it in the everyday too, as people trying to survive under the weight of literary occupation or actual occupation or academic occupation, right? So I think like anyone and everyone can and does resist in some way forms of canon, in whatever shape or form that may be in. It's just a matter of like, I put it in a book called Full Metal and Digiclear.
Oh, something seems to have happened here. We seem perhaps to be suffering some kind of connection issue. Do bear with us, everyone, while we handle this technical difficulty. We're just trying to get Joshua Whitehead back online with us. I wonder. Oh, he is telling us, I'm afraid that his power has just gone out. So that would affect, I suppose, his internet connection. I can maybe at this time mention the recipients, the random names we've drawn of signed copies of Johnny Appleseed. And so while we wait and while we try and bring Joshua back to the meeting, there are still a number of interesting questions. that we'd like to get answered. Okay, he's going to try connecting by phone, he says. But in the meantime, let me mention that we have drawn names for signed copies of Johnny Appleseed, and the recipients are Gabrielle Danilovic. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Gabrielle, but you are one of the recipients of a signed copy of Johnny Appleseed. And the other recipient is Tiffany Soster. So Gabrielle Danilovic and Tiffany Soster, we will be following up with you after the event in order to make sure that your signed copy of Johnny Appleseed gets to you. Joshua is going to try and reconnect by phone as a way to get around his sudden power outage. I suppose it's not terribly surprising that the power would go out in the midst of a Calgary blizzard. So I do apologize for that technical difficulty, folks. We can also, since we have a written archive of these questions, maybe we will reserve these for taking up in some kind of written form. We do have some other opportunities for public engagement with the writer in residence beyond Joshua's own work on his own writing and his work in providing critique and feedback to AU community members working on their own writing. I think, however, since we have had Joshua already fielding questions for about an hour now, maybe we'll take this opportunity to document the questions that we have remaining, and we'll, I suppose, otherwise just wrap things up for now. And thank you, everyone, for coming out. I do apologize that the session has ended rather abruptly, but I think we've had a good generative discussion so far, and we've certainly learned much of the writing life and some of the particular concerns of our writer in residence, Joshua Whitehead. Please do see the Q&A field for some of those other comments and questions. And if you're interested in contacting Joshua to have a look at your writing, you can look at the university's website for the writer in residence, which is writer-in-residence.athabascau.ca. With that, let me apologize once again for our technical difficulties, and let me thank everyone for coming out to join us for this conversation with Joshua Whitehead on bodies of writing. And I hope everyone has a good weekend, and we will hopefully see you back at another AU event shortly. Thank you, one and all.